everybody, we're going to open up with a word of prayer, and then I'll give you kind of a 30-second snapshot of what our Bible studies will look like after Easter, and then we'll jump into our Bible study from there. So if you would please bow your heads and fold your hands, we'll put our word in prayer. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this day, for the opportunity that you've given to us to come together as members of your body here at Chapel of the Cross, as Christians are gathering together around the world to celebrate Palm Sunday. Heavenly Father, we pray that you bless this time we have together as we study your word this morning, and that you would work on our hearts through your Holy Spirit. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So this is the last of our 7 deadly sins, so if you realize you missed one and you would like to go back and see the one you missed or whatever, just send the church office an email, send Lisa Borchard an email, and we'll get you the link for that. You can go back and watch any of the ones that you missed because they have been taped. Following Easter, we do have a new series of Bible studies coming. So obviously we've got Holy Week this week, Easter on Sunday. There's no Bible study in between the services. We've got the Easter breakfast downstairs. So in 2 weeks, we have 3 main adult Bible studies. Carl Silbert will actually be leading one, Hebrews, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so Book of Hebrews will be led by Carl. I'm not entirely sure where the rooms are going to be yet, so Carl, you may be in this one, you may be in the library.
I'm not sure. Originally, when I talked with Pastor Mark, we were talking about the conference room, so I could
maybe
use
the
the
conference
AV.
room.
But
I know
it
it's
seems
put out
the
that you're in
counters-
the library right
The
now.
counters
so.
have taken over that, so it might be in the library, and if we do that, I'm gonna have to redo some lesson plans, because there's really not AV there, so
We can get
I don't know
AV. We
either.
can actually get
We
AV
can
for you.
bring a cart in.
Okay, we'll be someplace, though.
Okay, so, yeah, and like we do on the first week of any of our Bible studies, there's sometimes some shuffling just depending on who goes to what. But Carl will be leading one on the Book of Hebrews. We've got Pastor Bob and Pastor Smith, who's a retired pastor who served at St. Paul's. He's going to be, the two of them are going to be leading a Bible study on 1st and 2nd Peter, I think, or maybe just 1st Peter. Just 1st Peter?
Just one of them, I don't know which.
Okay, so pretty sure it's 1st Peter. They'll be leading that Bible study, and then Andrew Nelson, our DC, and I will be leading one called the Sticky Faith Guide for Your Family. So it's based off of this book, and so if you've got kids, grandkids, this book kind of goes through raising your kids in the faith, giving them a kind of a good foothold in the faith as they make the transition to adulthood and living on their own. So that's what we'll be teaching. And like I said, I'm not entirely sure what rooms we'll all be in, but we'll figure that out in 2 weeks. All right, before we begin, are there any questions from any of the other sins that we've touched on over the course of the last 6-7 weeks as we head into this one? Neil.
I haven't missed any of them so far.
All right, well, good. Perfect attendance.
No, he don't mean he was here, he meant he hasn't missed doing any of it.
Perfect, yeah. I don't know what to say to that. Yeah, perfect attendance anyway. So this week, this week we're following up with the last of our deadly sins, and this is the sin of lust. We're going to open up to Matthew chapter 5. So there's this question at the beginning: when is adultery adultery? Because this is kind of at the heart of not just this sin, but a lot of the sins, especially the ones revolving around the 10 Commandments and our standing before God, our righteousness. So Matthew chapter 5, this is in the midst of the Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and it's in the midst of Jesus. There's a couple of different ways you can talk about what he's doing here. In one sense, he's raising the bar for people in terms of what they considered sin to be and what they considered, breaking the various commandments to be. On the other hand, the other way to look at it is he's not raising the bar so much as revealing to people what God's intention was with these commandments all along. So God's intention with the commandments was that he demonstrate for us the way that he wants us to live as his people, the way we were meant to live without sin from the beginning. What happens, though, and we see as Jesus talks in Matthew 5, not just with adultery, but some of the other sins with murder, with lust, is that we have a tendency in our sin to minimize the things that we're doing wrong to justify ourselves, to say to ourselves, sure, what I did maybe wasn't the greatest, but it didn't really rise to the level of what God is talking about here. And so this is kind of what Jesus addresses in Matthew chapter 5. So starting in verse 27, this is where he deals with lust specifically. So he says, "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it is better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell." So you've all heard these words before. Is there anything that stands out to you as you hear that again? Neil?
Well, it sure shoots down the philosophy that it's not a sin if you don't actually commit it and it hurts somebody else.
Yes. So the popular notion we have today that sin is a sin only if it hurts someone else, definitely does away with that.
There would be no chance of anybody having any of their eyes and hands without
Okay. So Jack's got a good point. How do you take Jesus when he says, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter into life maimed than to enter into eternal fire with all your members intact.
I don't know anybody that's done that.
Yeah, there are very few who follow through on that. Carl?
It's even beyond, it's not a sin if it doesn't hurt someone else. A lot of times they'll say if no one is hurt, but the person himself is hurt even if they don't recognize it.
Yeah.
That's where the real hurt is, or one of the real hurts is your own soul.
Yeah, and that's one of the things
That's the problem.
Exactly, and not just this sin, but with a lot of the others, and that's something that we don't always recognize and realize.
Wasn't there an early church leader, Origen or somebody, that actually put his eyes out?
There may have been, but I don't
in Alexandria.
I don't know if it was Origen or not.
I can't remember which one it was, but one actually did.
Yeah. So when Jesus says this, he's speaking hyperbolically, but it's so that everybody there really understands the seriousness of this sin, because it wasn't any different in Jesus' day than in our day. When it comes especially to this sin, we just don't think it's that big a deal. I mean, that's why a lot of our advertising uses scantily clad women, because sex sells is the mantra. And so as a culture, we've gotten to a point where we said it's not really that big a deal if you desire this man or this woman who isn't yours. But what Jesus is saying is the exact opposite. He's saying that it actually is a really big deal. It's such a big deal that this is the extreme you should think of going to in an effort to root this sin out of your life. We're going to look in a moment, and we're going to kind of treat King David's life as kind of a case study. We're going to walk through 2 Samuel 11 and 12, where it gives us a story of David and Bathsheba. And if you haven't read it in a while, more than likely you'll come across something there that you hadn't seen before. But in David's life, what we see is that the lie that we tell ourselves that this is not that big a deal in this, if I'm not really acting on it, why does it matter if I'm desiring someone else that's not my spouse? What we see is that desire wreaks havoc not just in our lives, but in the lives of people around us. Steve?
So, on this particular one, he relates lust to adultery. Is he speaking to married people only, or?
No, and so that's the question, when is adultery adultery? What do you guys, is it only adultery if it's married couples?
Doesn't sound
Not
like
according to the first verse.
Yeah. Yeah, so he
If
said,
there's lust in your heart,
yeah.
you've done it.
Yeah, so it's universal. A lot of times when we think of adultery, we think of it in the context only of a marriage relationship, that sort of thing. But Jesus is actually saying it's not just in the context of that relationship, and that's a bit of what he's going at in attacking kind of the misconceptions that some people have with the Ten Commandments. He does this with murder too. So he says, you've heard that it was said, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, anyone who's angry with his brother is liable to judgment. And so, the Pharisees, the Jews in Jesus' day were doing the same thing that we often do, which is, we look at the Ten Commandments and we, kind of treat them sometimes as a checklist, and we say, I can, maybe I fail on the coveting side of things, but I've never killed anybody. There's a great comic strip, and I should have found it for today. I'll try to get it in a couple weeks so you can kind of see it, but it's a comic strip that kind of demonstrates how we justify ourselves. And we do this regardless of how bad or our sin happens to be. And so if you're just your ordinary, average, run-of-the-mill sinner, you haven't committed in society's eyes, the really great sins, we kind of justify ourselves and we say, well, I'm not a really bad person. I've never cheated on my wife, I've never cheated on my husband, I've never killed anybody. You kind of go down the list of the things that we think are really bad. And then in this comic strip, what it does is it goes down and then it shows, someone who's, the quote-unquote really bad person, the person that's murdered someone, and he's sitting there in prison. He says, well, at least I'm not like those guys. I've never raped anybody. I'm not a child molester. And it just kind of goes down through this list that we always tend to put the level or the measuring line of the really bad people kind of one step above or beyond where we've gone. And so what Jesus is doing is he's erasing that measuring line and saying, you can't do this, guys. It doesn't work this way. Actually, you're guilty of all of these things. So you're guilty of murder if you've ever been angry with your brother or your sister in your heart. You're guilty of adultery if you've ever lusted after a man or a woman who's not your spouse. And so as Neil kind of started off our Bible study today, saying, he's never missed one of these. I thought he was talking, never missed one of the Bible studies. No. Neil was confessing his sins, saying he's never missed one of these sins. That's true of all of us. So we're all on an equal playing field here, which was Jesus' point in the Sermon on the Mount to erase our ability to, in self-righteousness, say, I'm better than those guys. We all need forgiveness. We all need that from Jesus Christ.
One
No.
thing about that.
Yeah.
You think like that, that's one of the worst things you can do, because you're putting yourself ahead of everybody.
Okay.
If you think I've never done that, so I'm better than him, that's the worst thing you can do, is try to make yourself look so much better than your fellow brothers.
Yeah. No, it's a really bad spot to put yourself in, so I'm going to turn this thing off.
Well, I've known people that say, I don't sin, I'm a good person.
They don't lie either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you see the other side of that too. We condemn ourselves because we know we're sinners, but there's other people out there who say, I live a good life, and I don't sin.
Yeah.
I've met people like that. I think they're gonna be saved because they look at themselves, I'm a lot better than that guy.
Yeah.
Especially Neil.
Yeah, so, Neil.
To add what Larry said, I've met evangelicals that have said, I've been cleansed of all my sins, I don't sin anymore.
Yeah, I haven't met very many people like that. It'd be interesting to sit down and have a conversation with someone that says that, and my guess is that it wouldn't take very long before the two of you uncover the fact that there has been sin, even
They wouldn't
after.
admit it.
Maybe not, but, yeah.
Well, in today's society, what is sin?
Uh-huh.
Everything's
Everything's
okay as
okay.
long as I don't hurt you.
And, or get caught.
Yeah, I get caught.
As soon as they said, the evangelical says, well, I don't sin anymore, he's lying. He's already sinning right there.
Yeah.
It's impossible not to sin. It's a Satan's fault. And you have to be very careful of that tricky fellow.
Yep. Open up to John chapter 8. So John chapter 8, it's the story of the woman caught in adultery. It's an interesting story on a number of different levels. First and foremost is the interesting note that you've got in your scriptures, which says, the earliest manuscripts do not include this account. So the story of the woman caught in adultery is not in some of the earliest manuscripts. It doesn't mean it was not a part of the original manuscript. It's just that the earliest ones we've got don't have this account, and so they make that note there. The reason it's included in the scriptures, even though there is that shade of doubt as to whether or not it was in the original of John's gospel, is because you see in it there's nothing that we get that we don't see in another part of scripture in terms of how Jesus is interacting with the people in the story and in the story itself. So in at the end of chapter 7, verse 53, so it says, they each went to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. So then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman, so what do you say? They said this to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask, he stood up and said to them, Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. Once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, Lord. And Jesus said, Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more. So a couple things here. As Jesus has this encounter with this woman, it's an encounter that's familiar because this happens quite often in the Gospels and in his ministry, where the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees are either bringing him people or bringing him situations to test him to see what he'll say. Their goal in this is to trap him, and he would be trapped. They thought they would have him trapped either way. So they bring him this woman who's caught in the act of adultery, and they say, so what should we do? The law of Moses says this, what do you say? Now if Jesus says, yes, the law of Moses says, stone her, have at it, then they can turn him over to the Roman authorities, because no capital punishments could be carried out apart from the jurisdiction of Rome. And so if he sides with the law of Moses, then they've got him, they can hand him over to the Roman authorities. If he says no and he goes against the law, then they've got him trapped, and they can out him to the people and say, here's a false teacher, he's going against the law, he's not upholding it. Jesus, as he often does, he turns the tables on them, and he says, as in verse 6, going down where he says, let the one who is without sin cast the first stone. So he doesn't go against the law, he doesn't even go against the Roman authorities. He simply says, whoever's without sin, you be the first one to cast the stone. And the interesting kind of little detail that John gives us in this gospel is the record of who leaves first. So it's the older ones who leave, the younger ones who, depending on where you are in life, you recognize that the younger we are, we tend to be more arrogant, prideful about those kind of things. And so the younger ones leave later on as they got more time for self-reflection. There's a couple different interesting things about this passage. What's missing in this story? Another way to phrase the question is, who is missing?
The men came to adultery with.
Yeah. So the law, it wasn't just the woman, if there was a case of adultery, who would be condemned. It was the man. And so this woman, she was caught in the act of adultery, which means they caught two of them. It wasn't just her alone. And so the man is noticeably absent. The other interesting thing is this is the only place in the scriptures where we have a record of Jesus writing. It's kind of maddening for us, whether that us is theologians or lay people, because we want to know, well, what was he writing on the ground as all of this was going on? It's take your guess. We're not given that detail. I had an interesting, get to you a second. So an interesting thought someone had a week ago that I'd heard, and I hadn't heard before, that perhaps he was writing the name of the man on the ground. I don't know if he was or not, but
Good in theory as
Well, but that goes along with the extra stuff we churn about and worry about is who was the person she was with? We don't know. It wasn't important. They
Yep.
didn't put it in here.
Yeah.
So I have trouble with, who was it? I still wanna know, you know? An idea, that gives an opening for the devil to grab a hold of me with something else, you know, and keep that going.
Yeah.
But that's throughout the Bible we come into that situation in my thoughts, because
Yep.
I churn with a lot of extra stuff that I don't need to churn.
Exactly, and it doesn't change the point of the story of Jack, and then.
I always thought that the men left, all the men left first because they had already been, and had been caught.
Oh, you thought the men left because they'd already.
The men in the crowd, yeah, they had to get out of there, 'cause it was next if they stoned her.
Okay. Matilda?
Well, wasn't it the culture of the time that you had to have 4 men, I think, witness against 1 woman in order to prove her guilty? And they didn't want to do that.
Yeah, so the law of Moses said that you had to have 2 or more witnesses, to something like that.
Yeah, the law of Moses, but does that pertain to the civil law too?
So the civil law of the Romans at the time, I don't know what their particular law was on that count. My guess is it's probably something similar, but I don't know that for sure. Okay, let's jump over to 2 Samuel as you're getting there. So I've got this quote: "Lust is to sex what greed is to money," and I thought that was a good quote to help remember, or at least help to keep us grounded in the way that we're talking. So, unfortunately, there have been times throughout the last 2,000 years where Christians would probably not say that, where the way that we as Christians talk about sex, we talk about it as something that's not pure and holy in and of itself. And so the quote is important just to keep in mind that the issue is not sex, that God created sex. It was a good thing from the beginning to be shared between one man and one woman. The problem is that in our sinfulness, we take the good things that God has given us and we twist them. And we do this with everything. I think it was C.S. Lewis was the one who said that the devil is not creative. He doesn't, he can't create things. What he can do, though, is take the good things that God has created and twist them in the ways that we use them. So money is the same thing. There's nothing inherently sinful with money, with having money. It's what does our sinful nature do when we've got a hold of it. Same thing is true with sex. This question, as we kind of move into the case study for 2 Samuel, why do you think lust itself is a deadly sin? So in the inclusion of 7, obviously there, when this list was first developed, about 400, 500 AD, there were sins that made the cut, sins that didn't make the cut. Why would this one in particular make the cut? Steve?
A little different way of looking at that. I mean, as human beings, we're created to be attracted to people.
Okay.
So there's a lot of psychology written about what first attracts. Think back when you were in high school, grade school, whatever, that first puppy love or whatever, it's usually physical. So the question in my mind is like, wait a minute, attraction, how does that differ from lust in some respects of the way you look at it?
Okay. Yeah, so the question, how does attraction differ from lust?
Yeah.
Throw it to the group, what do you think? I got my thoughts, but I'll.
Well, no, I was just gonna say that, like, the intro to the whole thing, you said, these deadly sins were like gateways to other sins, and so that's the same as lust. It's just a gateway to, I don't know if not greater, because, God calls all sins equal, but adultery and other things, it's just
Yeah.
a pathway to that.
Okay. Neil?
As far as attraction is concerned, I don't think it's a sin to appreciate beauty.
Right.
As long as you don't carry it to an extent, you can enjoy the appearance of a beautiful woman, or a very handsome man, or scenery, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But even within your mind, where's the separation? It's like you take it in your mind, you're thinking attraction, but then automatically you're thinking, okay, I'd like to be with that person.
Yeah. Amy?
I was thinking maybe the difference between attraction and lust is appreciating that person as a person, new creation of God. But lust, it seems you're objectifying them, you're thinking only about yourself, about what you want to get out of them, or, like, I think it switches that. That's,
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way to think of it. So when the attraction, the appreciation crosses that line to objectification, what can I get out of that? Then, yeah, you're right. I think that would be maybe one way to think of where that dividing line sits.
I was walking with a coworker of mine several years ago, and we were walking down the sidewalk, and we didn't know each other that well.
Mhm.
And a nice looking young lady came by, and we kind of looked at each other kind of sheepishly, and he said, "Steve, you know what I say when I see a good woman, a nice looking woman?" I said, "No, what?" He said, "Thank you, Lord."
Okay.
Which kind of goes to this, it's an appreciation of whatever is attractive, but then again, you get into the definition of the society defines attraction in today's world with all the advertisements, which is in and of itself a problem.
Yeah. Anybody else? Jack?
If I can remember right, you had to have lust before you think anything was attractive.
I don't think that. Okay, I'll give you.
I got proof.
Okay, Jack,
You could be laying in your bed in the morning, light thought, nothing, you've got lust with you. You won't have that lust get any attraction until you see your wife. Even you'll have attraction after you lust after something.
So,
That's pretty deep. So
Is that what Jesus
Get your
No, it's-
shovels out.
okay, so we're not gonna get our torches and pitchforks out. What I would say to that is that while it's true lust can precede attraction in the way that you've described it, it doesn't necessarily or always. So, Jamie?
Well, I was just gonna say biologically, your brain will fire with anything that you're attracted to. It's what you do after that. Like, not to put me on the spot there, but right, so a pretty lady walks down the street, a man's brain's gonna fire. It's what he does with that thought after his brain fires, because if you're naturally attracted to women, that's what you're gonna do. Your brain's gonna fire, and then that attraction is not necessarily bad, but where you take that thought after that.
But God made us that way.
Right, that's what I said, attraction's not necessarily bad.
Yeah, no, attraction's not bad. So we've been created to appreciate beauty, and so whether that's a beauty in a person, or beauty in nature, or beauty in a piece of art, we can appreciate beauty. The problem comes with this one, and especially with the way that Steve you asked this question. What's that dividing line between attraction, which is not sinful, and lust, which is sinful? It's, for all practical purposes, for a lot of most of us, it's a very fine line, and it's very. I think the reason the question is so difficult sometimes is because in us that transition happens so seamlessly and so quickly that most of the time we think of them as one and the same thing. I think a lot of times people would hear this from Jesus and say, well then, how could anyone look at a beautiful woman or a handsome man and not immediately lust? Well, it is possible. Whether that's very likely or not, it's possible. But the problem is that because of our sinful nature, that transition happens really quick.
It gets easier as you get older.
It gets easier as you get older?
It's easier to not have any lust anymore.
Of course.
Let's move on.
Okay, so moving on. So hopefully you got your Bibles open up to 2 Samuel. Okay, we're gonna.
I can no longer say anything.
Yeah, just. Jack's hit his word quota for the day.
You'll be deep doo-doo.
Okay. So as Kristen pointed out, though, with this question, why would this one make the list of the 7 deadly sins? The one thing I think that all 7 you could say have in common is that they are kind of gateway sins. Another way to kind of visualize that is they kind of sit at the top of the hill, and once the ball starts rolling down the hill, then as momentum picks up, this what might seem like a harmless sin, lust, turns into a lot of other very, very harmful sins. So it compounds sin. So one sin leads to the next, which leads to the next, which leads to the next. It's similar when, if you've ever, maybe especially as a kid or seeing it in kids, when you tell a lie and then because you told that lie, you've got to perpetuate that lie and you have to tell more lies. And at the end, whenever that lie gets found out, the state that you happen to be in is a billion times worse than if you just stopped the ball with that first sin initially. So
I haven't done it yet, but I'll intend to do it. So these 7 deadly sins were defined, I guess, came out of the Catholic Church, but I haven't paralleled them to the 10 Commandments yet.
Okay.
Which of these are really directly with the 10 Commandments too?
That's a whole other question.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but the way that we need to be raising our boys is, I'll tell you what, it could get you fired from your job. And now you cannot say, you can't look at someone and go, God, that dress looks great, or, anything. You better not, because, you could, some women are highly offended. I don't know what's happened to everybody. but-
Well, yeah, part of it is just we live in because we've, as a culture, more and more, we're becoming unmoored from, kind of our biblical foundation. And so what you're seeing is what you would expect to see, which is more and more as a society, we seem very schizophrenic because we don't have one bedrock moral that we're all drawing from. And so you see this with that case particularly. So yeah, as a man, you can get in a lot of trouble for saying something relatively innocuous to a woman, that it's a pretty dress, you look good today. But on the flip side, we as a society don't have a problem with objectifying women in a lot of our advertising, in a lot of other ways. And so because of that, our ethic becomes very situational. And it's very postmodern. It's, whatever feels right to you in that moment becomes right.
What about all this business with what they find on the computers nowadays? They kind of get.
Yeah, so with the
lust leads to more lust.
Yeah, and so with the ease,
Aggression.
with the ease of access for internet pornography,
Right.
It's led to
I
a
guess,
whole host of
yeah.
other sins and situations in marriage. We just had, for a circuit conference meeting with the pastors in the area, had a lady in to talk about the use of electronics, especially with children, and she's a psychologist, and so she was just sharing a lot of stuff from her practice and how things have changed over the years. And she said, the way she begins every marriage counseling session with couples, she just asks point blank about pornography use because it has become so widespread and it does affect relationships. I mean, you think it's just, I'm not doing anything to my spouse, whether it's my husband or my wife. It's just me, but it does have an impact on that relationship as well. So 2 Samuel 11, I'm going to walk through a couple of these verses. So starting the very first verse. So in the spring of the year, the time when the kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. So what's wrong with that picture? I mean, right off the bat.
David was supposed to go to battle
Yeah.
with his people, and he didn't.
Yeah. So, kind of the very beginning, as the scene is set for what unfolds, you got David, who's not out with his troops, where he ostensibly should be. He's back, the comforts of Jerusalem, at home. Then going on, so verses 2 through 5. So it happened late one afternoon when David arose from the couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her and came to her, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." So just one quick note here, Uriah the Hittite. This is not, and this is one of those details that it's sometimes easy to miss. It just depends, how closely you're reading a lot of the other scriptures, whether or not you recognize that name. Uriah the Hittite is not just a no-name person to King David. The reference I listed for you, 2 Samuel chapter 23. We won't flip there, but when you get there, what you'll see is that Uriah was one of David's mighty men. And so in the lists of David's conquests, because David was a warrior, a lot of the information about his battle, the battles that he fought, the people who fought with him is saved. There are a list, I think it's 37 or 39 in the lists of these guys who kind of stood out because of either an incredible battle that they fought or their fighting skill. Uriah is mentioned in both of the lists of David's mighty men. And so this was not a guy that David didn't know. I mean, this was, one of his, I don't know how close a friend you could say he was, but he was, one of his best soldiers. And so I think that's.
He was a neighbor too.
Yeah, and so he's obviously a neighbor too, but that also tells you something about the relationship, because it would only be people who were close to the king that would live in that close of proximity to where David's palace was in the first place. So just kind of adds another layer to this. This wasn't just a stranger that he did this to, it was close friends. So, as you look at these verses, so 2 through 5, what were the points at which David could have stopped his, the progression of his sin? So, and this gets a little bit into the difference between attraction and lust that we spoke about a moment ago.
First of all, he could have stopped looking.
Okay.
Bucked his eye out.
Gone inside.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, had he been where he was supposed to be, he wouldn't be there in the first place.
Yeah.
Isn't that often how lust starts? Like, had you been doing what you were supposed to be doing, you probably wouldn't have idle mind or idle hands, and
Yeah.
He would have been with Uriah and the men.
Yeah, he would have been with Uriah and the men out in the battlefield to begin with. So yeah, he was up on the roof of his house. It's that moment when he saw her. Even the text even tells us that she was a beautiful woman. Kind of gives us that tidbit. But then it's that transition happens between verse 2 and verse 3, where it says, "And then David sent and inquired about the woman." So, had he just stopped where he was, appreciated this is a very beautiful woman, and gone back inside and gone about his day, then that could have stopped that progression of sin. But it was that choice that he made to go and find out about her. Maybe he did that because he wanted to know. Obviously, he didn't recognize her, so want to know, is she single? Is she not single? But Steve,
Well, that kind of brings up one in my mind that I never thought about it. Was that kind of premeditated then? I guess not.
him staying behind you, David staying behind in Jerusalem.
Have the opportunity to.
No, so we don't know. I mean, we don't know why he stayed behind. All the text tells us is that he stayed behind, and as people were reading this account, that would have been noteworthy. I mean, a lot of times I think it's, for us, it's just one of those things that we read past because we don't live in that kind of a culture. But it would have been surprising, shocking that the king was not going out to battle with his troops, that he would send, his commander Joab in his place in that way. Yeah.
I guess I'm just puzzled too, like that. I mean, there's like a couple examples of stuff like that that happened back then. Did these women, did they not have the choice of saying, I don't think so?
Yeah, so a lot is made of that in this account. What's the culpability of Bathsheba in this? So yes, she had, like all of us in the decisions that we make and what we do with our lives, she had a choice to do that or not in one sense. On the flip side, she didn't have the freedom that, when we think of, the woman having that choice in their day, because David was the king, it was an abuse of power. Probably the closest thing I can think of this situation to today is, what do we make of the scandals that involve very powerful politicians and the women that they surround themselves with?
They think they can have whatever they want.
Yeah, and so
how many wives did David already have? Do we even know that? Was he one of those?
So David had more than one wife. At the time of Bathsheba, I don't know where she fell in the sequence, if she was the second.
We had at least one mistress at that time.
Yeah. Carl?
We can second guess all we want, we don't
Yeah.
know what's in the head. To me, the real challenge is to do what's right, and what I think of immediately is Joseph.
Mhm.
He was in a not too dissimilar situation, roles were reversed.
Right.
That he basically told the Pharaoh of Egypt, no,
Yeah.
through his wife, and he paid for it dearly.
Yeah. No, that's a great example, is that, yeah, those roles reversed with Joseph, who was in a, position of subservience to Potiphar's wife, and, when she tried to, have sex with him, he said no, left, and then faced the consequences for it. Yeah.
David was a total authority. People then didn't have the right to refuse him anything that he asked. So I don't think Bathsheba had a choice whether she's gonna answer his request or not.
Yeah, I still think she had a choice, but it wasn't.
It wouldn't have been a good choice for her.
No, yeah.
No, agreed.
Oh, and the other
Kristen.
thing to bring up is just, again, the culture difference, that, like, if Uriah was such a good soldier and friend, and he didn't even recognize who his wife was, that just points out, again, the difference between men and women. So it's not the same as Joseph and Potiphar's wife, because the difference between man and women on how they were viewed in society is completely different. I mean, there is
Yeah.
some similarities,
Yeah.
but it's obviously.
So, jumping down then to verse 6. So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. So, verse 5 is kind of the turning point for King David, because at that point, if she had not gotten pregnant, he could have gone on with his life. Probably no one outside of maybe the servants in his household and Bathsheba would have ever been aware of what he had done in his sin. But she's pregnant, and now that's going to be really apparent to everyone. And so David goes into, like we do with a lot of the sins that we commit, now he goes into emergency management mode, and instead of confessing his sin, which he should have done in that moment, he goes into the cover-up mode, which is what a lot of us do when we're caught initially. We begin to feel the pressure. And so David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing and how the people were doing and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house, wash your feet. So Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. Then David said to Uriah, remain here today also, and tomorrow, and I'll send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next, and David invited him, and he ate in his presence and drank so that he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. These sequence of verses is probably the clearest stark contrast that we see between the unrighteousness of David and the righteousness of Uriah in this moment. Because David, he didn't go out to the battle along with his troops. Uriah went. Now that Uriah is back, he refuses to go down to his house because all of his buddies, they're away, they're sleeping in tents, and so he says, I'm not going to go down and enjoy my wife and my house and all the finer things while everybody else, including the ark of the Lord, he says, is away. And then David tells him, go to your house. He sends a gift along the way, kind of butter him up because he feels guilty for whatever reason. And then the word gets back that he hasn't gone down to his house. So David then tries attempt number 2. Maybe if I get this guy drunk, then he in that moment when he's drunk and his inhibitions are lowered, he won't be so righteous, and he'll go down to his wife and he'll go down to his house, and then everything will be fine. He even waits a couple days. Uriah though doesn't budge, and so this leads us on to how we see when we've got one sin that seems relatively minor and inconsequential, David lusting after Bathsheba, then you've got adultery, and now we're going to have the murder of Uriah. So in verse 14, in the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling all the news about the fighting to the king, then if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near to the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebes? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead. So this little note about Abimelech, it's a story from Israel's past. It's found in Judges there, and it was something that was remembered in Israel when they were in the conquest. You know, they came too near the walls in one of their fighting in their battles, and this guy Abimelech was killed as a stone was tossed from the wall. And so it solidified itself in the popular memory of everybody in the culture. You know, when you're going out to war and you're besieging a city, you don't get too close, because if you do, you'll wind up like this guy Abimelech. And so he's not one of the guys that died in this battle with Uriah. It's a kind of a recollection of a previous battle. So in verses 20 through 27 then, so the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent to him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead. So before you get to David's reaction, you can think, at least in my head, you know, what would the reaction of a king be to news like that when you've got a case where you've got people dead for no good reason, really, because you went and fought in a way that everybody knows you just don't fight when you're besieging a city. It wouldn't be a good reaction. There should be anger on David's side. You know, how could you do this? Especially at Job, you know, this isn't how you fight a battle like this. But instead, you see David's response in verse 25. So he said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Job, do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. You know, David, so, you know, who at this point knows David's sin?
The servants.
Okay, so the servants in his household.
Bathsheba.
Bathsheba. Who else?
The Lord.
Joab.
Yeah, the Lord and David. That's it. Joab doesn't know. He knows that Uriah has done something to displease David, but he doesn't know that David's committed adultery with Bathsheba. I mean, obviously, the letter that David sends, he knows that Uriah has done something to displease the king in this way, that he's going to have him murdered. But the exact details are still unknown to him. It's one question that I wanted to just touch on really briefly was the account itself. So why did these accounts that obviously paint King David in a very unflattering light, and there are multiple examples of this throughout the pages of scriptures, why did these get recorded?
Part of scripture is to instruct us.
Okay.
And I think there are some object lessons here that even people like David and Moses, Joshua, are human and not God.
Yeah, exactly.
And it goes a long way to establish the truth of scriptures, because if this was a book that was made up, they wouldn't put a story in there about King David like this.
Yeah, and that's another point that's worth noting. So when it comes to this account and other accounts like it, when it comes to, you know, especially the New Testament, when you encounter skeptics who say, you know, this is, you know, not a trustworthy account, you know, whether, and for whatever reason they say, one of the things that stands out in its favor as it being a trustworthy account is this is not an account that you would have written down if you were, you know, just making it up or trying to put the best foot forward. Similarly with the New Testament, you get the charge sometimes with the New Testament that, you know, these books were written, you know, 60, 70, 100 years after the time of the disciples, and, you know, they were written in such a way to, you know, to kind of kickstart this brand new religion. But if you were to start a faith, you wouldn't write the Gospels in the way that you do, where you've got, you know, the disciples really up to the very end. It's only kind of in the book of Acts where they start to kind of click. You know, it's after Jesus' resurrection. Before then, these guys sound like a bunch of idiots because they never get it, what Jesus is doing. They never get what he's saying. Jesus is constantly reprimanding them. And so these accounts, as you know, kind of unseemly, as painful as they are, they lend authenticity to the stories themselves.
Well,
Steve,
whatever the current wisdom is or teaching on the inspired word of God, I mean, I simply go back to this is the inspired word of God. So
yeah.
Whether it's a choice by people to write it down, or whether God inspired them to write it down, you know, it's God's word.
Sure didn't sugarcoat anything, did they?
No. Lisa and then Kendra.
Oh, what does it tell you about God? It tells you that how much grace he has, that he was able to use David in such a big way,
Okay.
regardless of who David is and what David has done.
Yeah. Kendra?
Kind of off of what Lisa just said, it all points to Jesus, like our need for Jesus, our humanity, and how we're a mess. Even the guys that we have elevated to this high office of king need Jesus, and it's all scripture points to Jesus, the one who was perfect.
Yeah. Neil?
You know, the comparison between David and Peter is sort of stark here. They're both flawed, but true believers.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so they're both flawed but true believers. Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of getting out of it too, like, it sort of like builds on it, like, the original thing was just, wow, she is just beautiful, and then you took it to the next step, and probably the guilt and shame he felt after it was all done and over with and everything was far greater than any pleasure he ever had doing that.
Then, yeah, so it's probably, you know, David in the interim time, so between when he thinks he's gotten away with it, which is, you know, kind of where we see him now, and when he gets confronted by Nathan, there's an extended period of time. Now, chapters 11 and 12 follow quickly on each other, but we're told about this baby that Bathsheba has as Nathan confronts her. So we know it's been, you know, right about 9 months that David lives in this time where he thinks he's gotten away with it. And so I'm sure he's struggled with probably some guilt, probably some shame, probably on and off some existential fear of, you know, what's going to happen if this ever gets out. But then in chapter 12, so verse 1 is where Nathan comes and he tells this story, and he tells it in a way that it allows David to recognize his own sin or to convict himself. So the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said, "There were 2 men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, 'As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity.' Then Nathan said to David, 'You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul, and I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if all this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what was evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. And David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord has put away your sin, you shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is to be born to you shall die. Then Nathan went to his house. This account, there's a lot in it. So I'll make some brief remarks, and then unfortunately we're going to be out of time, and so I'd be happy to kind of discuss the rest of it with any of you later on. But one of the things that stands out really clearly at the end of Nathan's parable to David is the fact that we often have, we're really good at diagnosing sins in other people. We tend to have blinders on about our own sins. So this is the same thing Jesus says when he says, judge not lest you be judged. Take the speck out of, take the log out of your own eye before you try to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. The second thing is that what David says in his anger on hearing this parable, where he says, as the Lord lives and the man lives, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he done this thing. There have been commentators who have noted that David in his rash anger says this, and what follows in the course of David's life from this moment on is he has 4 sons taken from him. He's got first the child that he had with Bathsheba here. Then his son Amnon was killed by his other son Absalom. Then his son Absalom was killed as he rebels against his father. And finally, Adonijah dies at the hands of his other son Solomon, who would become king after him. One of the other things that is you can't miss is that, so Psalm 51, and I'll flip there just really quickly. This is the interesting thing about some of the Psalms of David that he writes, is that every once in a while as he's writing these, he gives us notes about what was going on in his life or in the life of Israel as he's writing. Psalm 51 is the one that he writes after he hears this from Nathan. And so the very first part of Psalm 51, the notes about it, he says, to the choir master, a psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet went to him after he had gone into Bathsheba. And so Psalm 51 gives us kind of a window into David's soul as he's experiencing what it feels like that Nathan's called him out in a way that only God could do. Because, at this point, it's only his servants, it's only Bathsheba and himself that know of the particularities of his sin, that know why he had Uriah killed the way that he did, how he had Uriah killed. And Nathan comes in with what should have been secret knowledge that God had given him, and basically outs David in full gory detail, all the stuff that David thought was hidden that really wasn't. So Psalm 51, and I'll read just a section of this and then we'll close. So he says, have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin, for I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and hold me with a willing spirit. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. As you see this and his response, even in the midst of his sin, this is why when Samuel is sent to go and anoint David the first time as David's boy, and he's looking at all these other brothers that David has, and he's thinking, this is the guy, this is the guy, this is the guy. And finally, God says, none of these are the guy. And Samuel says to David's father Jesse, is there anyone else? And he says, well, there's the youngest child. He's out with the sheep. And then when he's brought before him, God says to Samuel, this is a man after God's own heart. The Lord sees not as man sees. For man looks at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. It's in David's response that you see what that saying really meant. It's not that David was pure in a way that no one else is pure. It's not that he never sinned. You see in his reaction when God shows him his sin, what God saw there in David. So that's all we got. On the flip side, which we didn't get a chance to look at, but I would encourage you to do that, is some kind of tips to do to practice, not just this week, but I would encourage you to do this, that you acknowledge lust when it comes knocking. See and name how you're feeling, what you're thinking, and why. Recognize what triggers your lust. Is it a circumstance, a person, a time of day? So, if this were David, after all of this, I can't believe he probably went through his roof a whole lot after that. So recognize the things that put you in situations where your desire turns to lust, and avoid those. Notice your thoughts, your physical statement. Find 2 or 3 friends that you can be brutally honest with. Look at Christ. Receive grace as David did. With all of these sins, but with lust especially, it tends to be one that we hide, that we try to keep in darkness. And with any sin, but this especially, when you do that, it festers and it grows. And we're called as Christians to leave behind the deeds of darkness and turn to the light of Christ. So, that's it. Thank you guys for staying with me the last 7 weeks, and see you later on.